Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Laurette, Lynn, Unplugged Mom Radio version 2.0. Thank you so much for listening. I had the pleasure and the honor of joining Adam Kokesh from Adam vs. the Man a few weeks ago on his show, and now he is doing me the honor of joining us, the Unplugged Mom audience, so that we can hear his take on life and activism and troublemaking in general. So I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it with my first question for Adam. Adam, you are a natural-born troublemaker. So my first question to you is, why do you hate America?
I'm glad you asked it that way. It's not, do you hate America? It's why you hate America. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing in the accusatory nature of the question, but it's certainly not the same as, what do you still beat your wife? But no, why do you hate America? Let me count the reasons. No, it's an important question. And it does deserve some definitional untangling first, which is to say that if America is the people and the wonderful land that just so happen to be contained in these arbitrary lines drawn on a map by government, by the whims of politicians and circumstance of history, then no hatred. It's just people living their lives and thriving and doing well in a beautiful place to be doing that. But if you want to talk about America as putting those lines up, or the definition of what ties us together as victims of the United States federal government, then there are lots of things to be hated. But I like to step back as well. And while it's easy when you're a libertarian to say, oh, look at how much better things could be, and therefore I hate the way the status quo is now, when I've been able to step back and see it from a more evolutionary perspective, it's simply that statism is one step along the way, and we are evolving past it. And it doesn't do you any good to simply hate on something that is.
So theoretically, it's the tyrannical nature of the overbearing state. It's not really the country. Of course, I'm being tongue-in-cheek when I ask you that, but you brought up something interesting to me when you said drawing arbitrary lines, and that makes me think of borders. And this
Yes.
is a conversation that I've had many times with my husband, who incidentally admires you greatly because he is a fellow veteran. He was in the first Gulf War. He was in MI in Saudi Arabia, so he started listening to you for that reason. When we talk about that and then we relate it to the problems that we see in the political arena over immigration and the disagreements over immigration, it always gets me to thinking that we're still kind of so unevolved when we start talking about this. And it reminds me of children fighting over, well, this is my playground and I drew this line in the sand, so this belongs to me. And that's what it made me think of when you said that. So do you think maybe humanity is finally coming to a point where we can get past this, or do you think we're still going to be quibbling over imaginary borders and lines?
I think it's starting. I think it's actually really exciting to see that a global awareness is coming about like has never existed before in human history, thanks to, in large part, to the internet, but really all communication technologies. And we are seeing ourselves now able to communicate with someone in Tehran as easily as someone in New York. And then you have to wonder, well, why are they living under this system and we're living under this system? And you start to see the arbitrary lines drawn on maps for just that. And it really starts to call into question the tribalistic national identity that many of us hold very, very dear and are essential to bolstering our psyches, downward social comparison theory, right? We bolster our egos by in-groups and out-groups and comparing ourselves to those that we are able to somehow perceive as lesser. And I think that's going away. That's what's, and when we talk about it in these terms, I have to wonder if it's going to come, after the 3D printing, supercomputing, transhumanist revolution, that we're finally going to get past statism and nationalism. But I think we can see that process starting already.
Getting past statism and nationalism, I think when I start to think in those terms and I feel like, okay, we're progressing, we're moving forward in humanity. And of course, then I get the sense of hopelessness if I turn on the television, so I try to avoid that. But then I start to think, well, are we headed toward what one would call a one world government? And that's not exactly the territory or the direction that I want to go in. So is there a danger of heading in that direction when we start to strip away boundaries in the name of peace and strip away borders in the name of peace, and all of a sudden we find ourselves with not these separate statism colonies, which is what we have now, and all these different variants in nationalities and nationalisms, but now all of a sudden we've crossed over into this territory where... Did I lose you?
No.
Okay. Where it's become one world statism or one world government. Do you think that there's a danger for that?
Well, yes, there's a threat from that, but absolutely not from the perspective of what we're talking about, from, the tearing down of borders. What we're really talking about is the atomization of sovereignty. So if we were to dissolve the federal government of the United States, after the next election, then you would have 50 states that would still have their borders and would still have their state identities. And if you were to take that one step further and break it down to counties, you'd be able to keep going in that direction until you get down to individual private property. And I honestly, when it comes to how do we get to this voluntary state, I think this is how it happens, through localism. I've been a big proponent of this in the political realm when I was running for office. That, and by the way, if I ever run for office again, unless it's in a district where I can get sworn affidavits from 51% of voters saying that they'll vote for me before I file, it'll be running for president on the platform of dissolving the federal government entirely, either as an independent or Libertarian Party candidate. And I think that that's how it happens, that there is that local disillusion. I think this is important, too, when it comes to militarism, because people are starting to see as citizens of the world, like, wow, there are these dangerous things called governments, and they fight each other and kill lots of people for no good reason, and it just keeps happening. Well, what happens if we just all agree at some point, hey, no government is going to be bigger than X? And it's, something smaller than the average American state right now. I think that goes towards solving a lot of problems. But I'm looking at these long-term trends, and I'm very optimistic. And when you look at the longer-term trends and you look at the curves and the projections, and you see with, human productivity and technological capacity and computing power and life expectancy all going up on exponential curves, it's a lot easier to be optimistic for the long run. But Laurette, you're right to point out that for the short term, there is this threat that there will be, somehow tied up in these dynamics, a concentration of power, the potential of one world government. And you could say that in a way, we're already there with the United Nations as a sort of, club of mafia dons, if you will, for the existing powers that be. But we might get a one world government in a weakened state in the short term. And I think it'll be, by the time we get to that, there will be enough of a shift in the paradigm that its role would be extremely limited, because this is a process of 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. I mean, human evolution, human social evolution, and societal progress has always been 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. And so whether along the way that this unfolds, we get a step backwards and we have a one world kind of government for a while, is it going to be able to maintain its authority over so many autonomous regions? At that point, in this day and age, I think if we got to a global government, it might be actually part of a step in the right direction, because on a practical level, it would mean more autonomy for individuals, more local authority. But you're right to point out that it is a threat.
Well, there's a concern there, but first of all, you brought up a lot of points that I want to touch on. But the first one is the threat of the one world government having to be, maybe that's a step in the direction we have to go there. In other words, we have to go through that necessary growing pain in order to come out on the other side more evolved and more peaceful and into this true voluntary state where we have this volunteerism, and we're moving in that direction.
Hold on, I wouldn't say that we have to. We definitely don't have to. It might happen by bureaucratic momentum, so to speak. But I don't think, the real trend has to be and is essentially, and as I see conclusively from these trends, towards greater respect for the autonomy of the individual. Whether there is a social structure at the national level versus the state level versus the county level versus the global level, on the way towards that is almost insignificant.
Mm-hmm. I understand what you're saying. I think the concern is always brought up to me because being a somewhat of a student of history and taking an interest in history, it seems to me that historically, now I realize that we're at a different point now because our communications are what they've never been before throughout all of human history. But it just seems that societies seem to go through this very natural evolution where they begin with very good intentions and very well intentions, and it's all about for the people and volunteerist and all about education and service and communication. And then it expands, and it really goes back to the cliche, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, because the more it expands, the more bloated it becomes, and the state becomes bigger, and the state becomes more bloated, and it happened in ancient Greece, and it happened in ancient Rome, and then we have the Golden Age, and then it implodes. It all falls apart and starts from the beginning again. And that just seems to happen with all of civilizations all throughout history. So yes, we are at a different point in time now because we are connected globally, but in a way that almost makes it a little bit more scary. But when I take it back to just the national aspect, and I think, well, I think in this country, at least, we're kind of at that point where the bubble is pretty much expanded almost to the point where it's going to implode. Because I feel that absolute power and that absolute corruption of the state is really at a breaking point right now. So when I think about whether or not we can achieve that, and I've had so many conversations with Stefan Molyneux on anarchy, and I think because I'm libertarian in principle, and, that's lowercase L libertarian, there's so many people in this world that try to convince me that anarchy is really the way to go. And like we've spoken about before, there's really a sliding scale there. None of us, I don't think, commit to either one side or the other. And I do think that the basic idea of an anarchy society or a volunteerist society is theoretically beautiful. I just don't see it as pragmatic.
It's not just beautiful and pragmatic. It's inevitable. But it's inevitable because the alternative is not pragmatic. The idea of coercion or a coercive monopoly, that's what's impractical, and that's what we're seeing, and that's what humanity is learning the hard way right now.
But is that something that we can see in our lifetime? I mean, I think that humanity is evolving to that point, but whether or not we'll actually get there without any kind of interference or, almost like it cancels itself out, it just seems hopeless. I guess is where I'm going.
Well, I mean, what's hopeless? I mean, I think if anything, it's very hopeful. You say within our lifetimes. Remember, we're approaching longevity escape velocity where nobody dies of old age anymore. So you will probably, you're relatively young and healthy and fit, and if you're in that category, you're probably going to live to see a lot of these things happen in the next couple hundred years. But I really think that that's the kind of timeline we're talking about here, because government is, one thing Marx got right was technology determining social organization. And this goes back to evolutionary history, like when we were living in a primitive state. How were we organized? Whoever could pick up the biggest rock was in charge, and it was in your best survival interests to go along with that and to be a part of that tribal system or to be a part of that pack and to go along with the pack leader. And as we've had the technological developments that we've had, as we've learned to communicate, simply, the technology that is language has gotten us to the point, and I think by itself would have eventually gotten to this point where there is the universal realization that persuasion is a superior way of relating to others than coercion. And this really gets down to a matter of biological, forces of nature. When the first, take it back before humanity even existed, right, to the primordial soup. Well, you had energy spiraling into proteins, and then you had proteins combining to form, pre-cellular little, subcellular organisms, and then you had single cellular organisms, multicellular, and those which survived and reproduced were those that were able to coordinate the most amount of energy and natural resources into sustaining that spiral of energy that was that life form. And just by those forces of nature, if nothing else, humanity is evolving towards a state of what we as primitive libertarians in the 21st century would call a voluntary society. But really, it's just a gradual obsolescence in human society of all things coercive.
Moving toward, and you're certainly giving me a new perspective, so I thank you for that, but moving toward a voluntary society, a lot of the rhetoric that is thrown around in conversations that I have tries to persuade folks like me from being active politically. Pretty much the mantra is that it's part of the problem, that you're adding more fuel to the fire. So that always makes me wonder, when we talk about these things as libertarian-minded folks, how does that reconcile with the work that we do politically and, like you said, running for office or being involved politically? Because I myself, and my audience knows that I've struggled with that, and I've gone back and forth where I would feel convinced myself that my action, and I've been involved politically here in Oklahoma. I did a lot of work for the 10th Amendment resolution, and I was very heavily involved in the Ron Paul campaign, and then I slid back out thinking, you know what, I don't think this is the right direction to go in. I think maybe avoiding this is the right direction to go. And of course, then you had those of us who felt that infiltrating the Republican Party and trying to change it from within was going to help. And then I pulled back out of that thinking, nope, that's not going to work. That's not how we're going to get anything done. We have to support a third party. To the other extreme where I said I need to wash the blood off my hands completely because this isn't working. So I just wonder how being active politically and being involved reconciles with the eventual goal of breaking down the political system.
Sure, it's a really good question. I do have an answer for that I think is helpful.
I hope so, because it's something that plagues my mind.
Sure, and this is really good because I think it's an issue for a lot of libertarians face. And of all the sort of philosophically committed hardcore voluntarists, I'm very much, a relative moderate when it comes to talking about political action. I'm very much in line with, I think, Ron Paul's perspective on this, and he was very encouraging when he came out in his farewell speech to Congress and said very specifically that that politics, political action may nudge things one way or another, but what really determines how society is going to be organized is the paradigm and spreading the message and having people understand this. And I think what's most important, because he says that, and then he never talks about what you actually do as a result. Am I supposed to just read the newspapers and sit on the sidelines and just be well informed? No, I mean, there's a lot more to it than that. And you certainly know, as a mother, all the things that you can do in actual ways to raise your child differently than the way the state would want you to, and I think that's very important as well. But I'm a relative moderate in the sense that I really do see the value in politics and in political action. But we have to understand exactly what that value is. So if Ron Paul was an educator, a messenger, and he changed the paradigm with everything that he did and running for office, running for president in particular, then what Rand Paul is doing as playing the politician right now, being willing to speak out of both sides of his mouth, although I believe that Rand isn't really a libertarian because he said so. I don't think people try to say like he's lying and he's really one of us, and it's like, well, I don't want a liar. Then if he's a liar, he's not one of us. But right. what he's doing really is capitalizing on the work that his father did. He's building a coalition of people, whose attitudes have been changed, and maybe on certain issues their minds have been changed. And he's trying to build that into a coalition to build some political power. And I'm gonna make the bold prediction that it's strategy-wise not going to work, because he's not winning converts like his father did. He's winning votes or potential votes or voters. And the powers that be are going to be able to make him the controlled opposition of conservatism going into 2016. But when it comes to you as an individual, political action versus activism versus actually working to help people make the state less relevant in their lives, raising the next generation to have a better perspective on the state, encouraging civil disobedience, encouraging tax resistance, encouraging people to live their lives according to their values. And I think that has a much deeper impact and is a much more long-term solution and is not only more satisfying, but it also is very empowering and doesn't tell people like, hey, you should be free, now you should go beg some politicians for permission to be free. And when Ron Paul said that politics can nudge governance, one way or another, what he's saying is that the political reality is a reflection of the paradigm. And I see the paradigm shifting more because of technology, because of culture, because of people like us in independent media who are driving the paradigm shift and encouraging people to think differently. That is going to be reflected in government one way or another, right? I think it was Frederick Douglass, the limits of oppression will be determined exactly by the tolerance of the oppressed, something to that effect. And we are changing the tolerance. We are lessening the tolerance. And as long as there are liberals and conservative statists who are going to turn in this market for violence to government to do things, that will always be the product. We will always be dealing with this kind of statism. But when the paradigm shifts, it'll be reflected one way or another, whether it's from the government collapsing, or you're going to see a politician you're going to see like the sequester, right? And Obama's going to be up there, and he's not going to change anything about his own policies. But let's say that the sequester, and I don't want to pass judgment on that particular propaganda piece, it represents some scaling back of government. Look at Italy, for example. Beppe Grillo, and the comedian who is now leading the five-star party in parliament there, has a proposal to cancel an order that is for 10 F-35 fighter jets that's going to cost his country $13 billion, that is 70% over budget and 7 years late. And you're like, wait a second, how does it get to that point in the first place? What kind of crazy bureaucratic momentum would allow for Italy to be in that situation? And it doesn't happen necessarily because the people go, now we're going to elect a libertarian. No, it's just because the equation has changed. The militarism isn't as much of a value as it used to be, and so people are saying, geez, maybe that $13 billion would be better spent at home here in Italy. So when you say what is the political action versus activism versus changing the paradigm decision, for me, when you see an opportunity to change governance, when there is a ballot measure out, for example, like in Colorado with recreational marijuana, right? And in order for the government, and this is where Molyneux's perspective of the tax farmer is so important, when the government, in order to maintain its credibility, has to allow the cattle to vote on, whether or not they're going to have recreational marijuana, and you have a chance to say, yeah, freedom or not, I'll take the freedom here, and you can get out and actually change the governance, it might be worth your while. And in times like that, when you see that the government is lagging behind the shift in the paradigm, you can push it to catch up. But which one is more important? Clearly, changing the paradigm is more important. And more often, you can be absolutely assured that the work you're doing in changing the paradigm and waking people up and getting them to change their lives is having an impact, is having a long-term effect, and your resources are being used efficiently in that activism, where in politics, most of the time, you end up banging your head against a wall and wasting so much time trying to convince people of something that they're never going to be convinced of. Like instead of going to the vast group of potential libertarians who aren't involved in politics at all or are just sort of tuned out, and winning them over, you're going into the Republican Party trying to talk to the gray-haired statists, and I can tell you this from my experience running for office, they're the ones least receptive to the message of liberty, the Republican establishment. And I don't mean the leadership. I mean the establishment as in the people that go to every monthly GOP meeting. And, the gray hairs that demand that the government conduct wars and protect their Social Security in a very, very conservative way. So that's why I have so much more confidence working on the long-term solution rather than going for the quick, the heroin shot of politics, thinking, oh, if we just elect someone, then that's going to solve our problems. And that has a host of other hazards as well. Like, I don't think, first of all, Ron Paul was not running to win. That was pretty clear. Now, for what reason exactly, you'd have to ask him. But what would happen if he won? And this is what gets me about all the people who working within the Republican Party talking about the RNC last year, going, oh, my God, these lying, murderous thieves, they broke their own rules at the conventions. Like, well,
what did you expect?
If you really believe that that's what we're up against and that's who we are, they were going to let Ron Paul waltz into the White House and they weren't going to shoot him? Like, really? So what happens if we elect Rand Paul and we still live in a generally statist country and he doesn't wake anybody up and all the powers that be go, well, let's do everything we can to make his presidency a disaster? What if it was Ron Paul and they decided that was the time? Oh, Ron Paul's elected? Oh, he's going to do some monetary policy stuff? Check this out. We're going to crash the dollar and institute a global currency. If you don't change the paradigm, if you don't have a solid foundation for that political shift, you're really going for a temporary or short-term solution that has a lot of pitfalls and can even backfire.
Well, at the beginning, I will admit at the beginning, I was very hopeful that Ron Paul could possibly be a new president. But as time went on, it didn't take me long to realize that this is not what's going on here. And it was actually a very positive experience for me because I saw so many people become more aware, not necessarily active, but at least aware. And they were making different decisions and they were doing different things and they were communicating, and more people were coming together and sharing ideas about liberty, and liberty was suddenly becoming popular again. And people were reading the Constitution, and people were interested in what the message was.
Right.
So it became clear to me from the beginning that his running for president was more about waking people up, proverbially waking people up, than about actually winning the presidency, because that really, the whole presidency thing has become corrupt in and of itself. So it was more about getting the people from the grassroots to really take action. And, you brought up so many interesting things. And, Adam, I got to say I'm really inspired by you right now because you are able to answer the questions so eloquently and make so much sense. Like, one of the points that you brought up is you created a distinction. And you're one of the first people, or the first person that I've spoken to in this type of conversation that has created a distinction between being a politician and being politically active. And you're really focusing on the grassroots actions and what we the people, you and I, folks like you and me, can actually do to be aware and be involved and make a difference. And I think you personally and what you do, and I'm specifically thinking of all the challenges that you have created for the establishment, like dancing at the White House. That was phenomenal. That's a family favorite in my house, by the way. My kids love that video. And this is a real inspiration for people. And, the way we raise our children and the way we protest oppressive laws and oppressive taxes and the way we demand freedoms and the way we demand changes in legislation, these are the things that we can do. And there's a distinction between that kind of action and just being part of the grand old party. Because going and asking permission to be free, Adam, I've said this before, and I think you'll agree with me. If you have to ask permission for freedom, that's not freedom. That's fake. So this is very inspiring to me, and I really appreciate the input that you're giving us. So I guess the next natural question then is, considering everything that we've said here, if Rand Paul does find himself on the Republican ticket, will you support him?
Well, what does it mean
publicly?
Yeah. Well, let me just say one other thing, and to round off that last subject, because there is one other place where for me as a voluntarist, I see an incredible value in politics, and that is taking advantage of the platform. I think that's what Ron Paul did, and using that. I mean, if we're going to be taxed to make government important, and government is going to create this platform, and you can jump up on it and be amplified in doing so and get people to consider our ideas who wouldn't otherwise, I think that's a great value as well. So if Rand Paul is on the ticket, will I support him? I guess.
Will you endorse him? I guess that's a better question.
Would I? If it was, I mean, if I was endorsing someone in the Republican primary for president, and it was Rand Paul and Judge Napolitano was not running and Gary Johnson was not running, then yeah, there was no one more libertarian. I would say, yeah, I mean, I will endorse the least evil candidate in the race. But I think in terms of support, active support or endorsement, if it was Rand in the Republican Party, I'd probably be more inclined to support the Libertarian Party nominee if that is they get their act together and do better than they have the last two cycles with Bob Barr and Gary Johnson. Now, Bob Barr, I really do have some animosity towards, not as a human being, of course, and Gary Johnson, as I absolutely love him, but I don't feel that. As not a philosophical libertarian, he's really up for being a standard bearer of the party, and that's why I didn't actively get behind his campaign last year. So if we can put up someone who represents the philosophy, then then I can really get behind him, and that's or her, and that's for two reasons. One is that I know any support that I would lend to them in blowing them up and helping get someone's name out, it would be promoting the message, would be actually waking people up. Gary Johnson didn't do that. Gary Johnson did not speak from the philosophy. Rand Paul does not speak from the philosophy. Ron Paul does. And the other distinction that's important is, and this was the faith that I had in Dr. Ron Paul, was that if elected president, he would do his best to practically move us in the direction of absolute liberty. He would, with the morality principles of libertarianism guiding him, do his best to reduce the coercion through government in society. Whereas, with no stops, at no point will Ron Paul say, well, we can't do that because I want government to be able to do that.
Right, and he's uncompromising.
Right, and that's where I don't have faith in Rand. And if Rand says, well, I'm a libertarian, and of course he said in different interviews that he is and then that he isn't. If he says, well, I'm a libertarian, but I do believe in some foreign aid to Israel, or I do believe that sometimes we can put sanctions on a country, which is an act of war, and and not call it war. And and it's just sort of like, well, if you're not grounded in the principles, then what you're saying is that force, coercion, can be applied based on your preference. And I don't trust you at that point. This is why,
right.
Ron Paul, in a sense, was the compromise, that we would have someone, representing us at all, but that we would have someone who we could trust to conduct himself and conduct policy based on those moral principles. And if you see someone like even Justin Amash justifying foreign aid to Israel that he voted for specifically, you're like, well, wait a second. So if you think, because as soon as you violate the principles once, and you don't say, well, we'd like to eliminate foreign aid entirely and get, this is my philosophy. But if you just say, well, I'm a libertarian and, well, sometimes it's okay to steal from the American people to give to the government of Israel. You're like, whoa, wait a second. On what grounds? Because Israel is an ally, a friend. Well, who's the next ally? Well, what's the next time that situation might arise? And if it's based on subjective criteria, how do I know you're not corruptible? That you can't be swayed?
There's so much when you start talking about that. It becomes so much more complicated because there's a difference between what we're told as a society and the information that we're given. And the reality of the situation. So if we're to say the people have the power to make decisions and grassroots and we can make the change, we can support candidates that we want, that are going to really represent freedom and liberty. We're making these decisions based on the information that we think we have, but the information is not always accurate, and that's when things become murky, and that's, of course, when communication comes into play and the power of communication. And I think more and more people are kind of waking up to the fact that we've been duped.
Mm-hmm.
And that's become a problem, and that's created a lot of confusion right now, and we're kind of turning against each other. We're banding together in one sense, but turning against each other in the sense that we're confused over what the actual truth really is. And that's becoming an issue. And I think that's why folks like you and even like Alex Jones, their work is so important in not really uncovering what the reality is, but really just uncovering the fact that what you think is reality might not be. So we need to start really questioning everything. And I think maybe humanity is at that point now where we're going through a little bit of a growing pain because we're trying to figure out what is real and what is not real. But the good news is that we are figuring out, at the very least, not to have absolute trust in absolute power. And then that brings me back to a place of a little bit of hope, because I do realize that maybe it is possible, like a true voluntary society, anarchy society, free society is possible, because we're almost there if you really break it down and think about it, because if through our inaction we've allowed this power to become corrupt, and we really have, through complacency and apathy and inaction, we've allowed this statism to become overblown and corrupt and have this authority and power that we don't want it to have. So if we have that kind of power, then we've allowed it, and that means that we are already in a voluntary society, even if it's through involuntary action. So, the hope is that it is possible, and we are in this state of confusion right now. But moving in that direction, I want to kind of ask you a couple of questions moving in that direction, because you are a purveyor of truth. You are someone who will get on the microphone and say, this is a lie, you've been duped, and this is the truth, and this is how we're going to deal with it. Now, I know that that's met with a lot of criticism and a lot of resistance, and folks like you are often accused of being alarmists and fear-mongers. So when you're met with that kind of criticism, how do you respond to that?
I don't know. I really don't get that one a lot. And I think that's one of the nice things about the perspective that I've developed. I don't get accused of being a fearmonger. Hardly ever, I don't think. Because if you see this as an evolutionary process and you accept this long-term view, and you're not caught in some religious dogma or trying to get reality from a book that was written by Bronze Age tribesmen and cobbled together by an emperor at the Council of Nicaea, then you're able to see this process as a beautiful one that you get to participate in, not some epic struggle between good and evil. And I think I point this out in contrast to Alex Jones, right? Mm-hmm. Who I'm starting to get compared to a lot, because we have the same sort of attitude towards immediate government and policy issues, but he uses the fear-mongering to sell products and mm-hmm. to get people to be as manic as he is. And my message is like, no, check this out. It's an amazing world that we live in, and this is a beautiful process that's happening. And if you like, you get to be a part of it. You don't have to. There's no imperative. It's a much more empowering, liberating choice. And I think that's what I offer that is distinct from so many other fear-mongering type of libertarians, is that ours is a message at Adam versus the Man of true empowerment, not of struggle, not of a fight, not because like if this is a fight and it's like, well, if we don't stand for freedom here, then it's 100 years of darkness. I don't believe that. I mm-hmm. can't believe that. That is something that people sort of jump to as an ungrounded assumption, because it fits a convenient narrative that has been so ingrained in the human psyche. It's easier to manipulate people when you do that. And mm-hmm. I don't want to manipulate people. I want to inspire, and I want to enlighten, and I want to empower people, to exercise self-ownership.
The whole point is to free people
yeah.
of manipulation. So
right.
I'm my point was to punctuate that, because that is something that I admire about you. I'm not a huge fan of the Alex Jones way of doing things, and I've been told it's because I'm a woman. I don't respond to him very well, but I don't really think it has anything to do with my vagina. I think it just has to do with the fact that I don't think he's really accomplishing anything through the method that he's using, and I prefer your method of delivery because I do feel that you have a more positive approach. So thank you for that. And moving in that direction, I want to find out more about what brought you to this place. You are an activist, you're a rabble-rouser, and you do it in a great way. But how did you get here? Who was Adam Kokesh before this?
I've always had a healthy disdain for authority. I think my parents were very effective in passing that on. And it's just become better thought out over time. I was a punk kid growing up. I was always getting in trouble and making things difficult and challenging my teachers. And they all said that I was going to grow up to be a lawyer. But I had to not go to law school just to prove them wrong, and ended up doing this instead. So, I started off in high school wanting to join the Marines to get away from my parents' divorce and get away from joint custody and really be able to sort of prove myself as an individual. And I got that out of the experience, but I also got the motivation from my combat tour in Iraq to do a lot more soul-searching about the implications of what I believed. And then I was involved with Iraq Veterans Against the War, and a big phase of my development was being surrounded by anti-war liberals and saying, well, heck, I'm a libertarian. I know I'm right about everything. Now I just have to prove it to these people. And I wanted airtight arguments. I really wanted to be able to say, I'm right because, look, here is the proof. I wanted to be able to show mathematically, so to speak, how libertarianism was correct. And that kind of passion, for intellectual integrity and intellectual consistency is what has gotten me to where I am today. And you learn to stop resisting when your assumptions are challenged. And that's the kind of state I've been entering into, and I've been seeing stuff just every day online, and I love being able to do what I do because I get to spend so much time in this unique headspace where I get to challenge my assumptions, I get to ask questions, I get to look a little deeper, and I get to ponder where all this is going. If you want to really get where what I've been thinking about lately, it's sort of where does this end up going to continue the evolutionary course of life on Earth itself, or potentially what is the role of life in the universe. If you believe in the Big Bang and evolution, then you can follow those arcs to their logical conclusion. And I've thought of the gray goose scenario. Are you familiar with that? Mm-hmm. So, nano robots take over the planet and turn everything into gray goo. And I have a feeling that that's essentially what humanity is going to be doing to the universe. When we're 3D printing rocket ships in our backyards in a few years here and mining asteroids and exploring the cosmos, then at some point we're going to be bending it all to our will. The natural world is going to be bent to the will of humanity, of life, of the entropy of energy. And that's how it all comes full circle, and back into the black hole we go. And if not us from this particular little spark of life on planet Earth, then eventually somewhere else in the universe, similarly intelligent beings will arise and be able to take the universe through its cycle of life one more time. And I think that's that's kind of where this goes. And I'm thinking about it on this bigger scale. And when you're able to see it in those terms and examine the experience of life itself in that context, what are we as individual human beings but spirals of energy? That in and of itself is very liberating and takes us away from so many of the temptations of religion and doctrine and politics and dogma and the mentality of the status quo, in really living in a Zen libertarian perspective. And it pulls you away from all of those psychological weaknesses that would have us turn to tribalism or to aggression. And that's really the empowerment I'm trying to share with people through my show and through what I do. And I think even if I'm only some tiny drop in the bucket for how that is happening for humanity, I wouldn't want to be doing anything else. And that's what really motivates me, is to be a part of the force that gets to shape the destiny of humanity. It's just the fun that I'm having with my time here.
Well, you know what, Adam, it is a tiny drop in the bucket, but there are so many tiny drops in the bucket, and you're really speaking my language right now, because it's a realization that I've come to as well over the last couple of years, and I verbalized it in different ways than you, but I think the message is the same. I found it personally very liberating when I was able to free myself from my ties to dogmatic religions and dogmatic beliefs, and even beliefs in the paradigm or beliefs in any kind of structure. And when I was able to really unplug, quote unquote, or separate myself from any particular label that defined me, and realize that who I am essentially is this bundle of energy, and at some point in time my body's not going to matter anymore, and I'm able to look at all of humanity on the same scale and realize that, hey, we're all in this together, and no matter what we share and what differences we have on the surface, ultimately the goal is freedom. Everyone wants the same goal. Everyone is after the same thing. And when we're able to share that message, it's almost like we're improving the quality of our time here, so that we can kick off and enjoy ourselves and really just go along for the ride. And then you get to this place where you think, well, what's the whole point anyway? And you want to just give up on everything. But the point is to evolve intellectually and to evolve spiritually and to really find that true peaceful freedom and liberation. And that really is the point of it all. So even though it's just one little drop in the bucket here and one little drop in the bucket there, it doesn't matter, because altogether it really is that ocean of freedom that we're all really after and we're all really looking for, and what really brings us all together. So that rounds off the conversation really well, because it brings me back to my original assertion that sometimes I find this hopelessness, and now here it is. And you've highlighted it again for us. And you know what? This interview has been fantastic, because I've learned so much from you, and I think the audience will learn a lot from you. And I thank you so much for your time, your dedication to intellectual pursuit, and your dedication to freedom and activism, but in such a positive way. You bring such a positive message to everyone that you touch. And I'm really grateful for the work that you do, and I'm grateful that you've taken time this morning, and I know that it's early for you, to dedicate your knowledge and your experience to me and to my audience. But before we go, I do have one last question. You mentioned when you were talking about, when I asked you about endorse, whether or not you would endorse Rand Paul, and you were talking about the candidates that you feel comfortable putting your weight behind, and you did say he or she. So let's just suppose that I was to run on a libertarian ticket.
Sure.
Could I have your endorsement?
I'd love to see that. And are you considering running in the libertarian primary?
You know what, Adam, I have considered running for several different offices at several different times, and I usually talk myself out of it for two reasons. Number one, my kids are not old enough yet, and they require too much of my attention now, and
Sure.
I'm dedicated to being a mother. Number two, like you, I was a real troublemaker. And when I was growing up, and I challenged authority, and I made a lot of waves because my energy was not directed in a positive direction at that time. So I think that I have way too many skeletons in my closet.
Well, if there was ever a point at which you decided that for some odd reason running for office was a more effective use of your time than what you're doing now, I would be very happy to support you in any way I can.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I don't know what the future will hold, and I keep saying that it's probably never going to happen. But I do know that right now in my life, what I am doing in my advocacy work for pulling children out of school and saving them in that way, and like I said when I was on your show, the best way to wake people up is to not put them to sleep to begin with, and keeping them out of that place of indoctrination where they are free to really expand their intellectual muscle. That is what I'm dedicated to right now. I know that there are different phases of life, though, and when they're older and I'm at a different phase in my life, we'll see what happens. But I wanted to know in advance that if maybe 10 years from now I do decide, I can call on you, because I have a feeling you're going to have a lot of influence. So.
Things are going to be radically different in so many ways just 10 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm starting to be hopeful that they're going to be different in good ways, because we're really putting positive messages out there, and I meet more and more people every day and connecting with the folks, especially with tragedy and hope, and just realizing that among all the tragedy, there is a lot of hope, and it really does make me feel very good, just as I feel after this interview. And again, Adam, thank you so much. I know it's early for you. I'm sure my audience appreciates it, and I hope to connect with you again sometime in the future.
Let's hope. I really appreciate what you're doing. Keep it up. And if you want to check it out, adamversustheman.com, or get in touch with me, adam@adamversustheman.com. Thanks so much, Laurette.
Excellent. Thanks again, Adam. We'll talk again soon.